you have to start in the world of personality with the work of somebody named Sigmund Freud. How many people in class have been in some other class where you've read some thing? But yeah, right. So a large number of people are not starting from scratch. Obviously, the nature of today's class is that it's brief. We'll be done with Freud in 20 minutes. So if you've been in a class with a lot of Freud, feel free to add something and ask questions. But there'll be stuff you already know that won't be here today. The biography of Freud will not be on the exam, but I'll just say a few words about Freud. Freud was born in Vienna. I think it's 1859. Yeah, that's right, or that's close to right. He was born in a lower middle class Jewish family in which he was the first son, and some mix of his family and or the cultural circumstances made Freud and his family expectant of Freud being a famous person. There's all these details of Freud's life that are almost hard to believe, in which Freud is given the biggest room in the apartment so he can study. A sister of his plays the piano. It makes too much noise. He can't study. They throw out the piano. All this stuff happens in which the family kind of puts all their eggs in one basket of little Sigmund. It turns out that it pays off. Little Sigmund turns out to be really smart. He enrolls in college at the University of Vienna. If anybody's in a pre-professional program here, he essentially enrolls in exactly what you would have enrolled in, college with medical school admission, as long as he doesn't get bad grades. He doesn't get bad grades. He becomes a physician. A bunch of quirky stuff happens. So by the time the 30-year-old person reaches the age of maybe 50 or so, he's not exactly a physician anymore. He wanted to be a research biologist. There's anti-Semitism in Viennese society at the time. He was told he would never be given a real full professorship. So he started to look around for other things to do and started to treat patients. And by the time he becomes an old person, Freud lives until 1939. By the time he's an old person, Freud is one of the 10 most famous people in the world. And he's famous not for being, of course, a physician, but a psychologist. And we'll say what happens is, in a nutshell, and this is what we'll get to, he develops a therapy for medical problems that ends up being psychological. He sees psychological problems at the root of some medical problems. So it's somebody, if you're pre-med, Freud's training is not at all, it's like, it's exactly yours, except in the 1880 version. But then he suddenly converts and becomes a psychologist because he thinks there's a psychological origin of some types of psychological distress. Also, the stereotype of Freud that you have from society is actually pretty correct. If you imagine somebody sitting next to a couch and the person over here talking about their problems while Freud listens, that's exactly right. That is Freud. That's his couch. Which is in London. He was in Vienna until 1938. He had enough connections that he was able to get out of Vienna before the Nazis fully moved in, and they moved his stuff to a Freud museum in London. But if you're ever in Vienna, the original site is still there. There's a Freud, where he lived in one of these places where there's an office building, and he lived right upstairs in the middle of the city of Vienna. Oh, last bit of biography. When that last century ended, A&E, not that I'm extolling the virtues of A&E in biography, but this is what you do every time a millennium ends. They'll do it again next millennium, can't wait. They rated the most influential people of the millennium. Freud didn't do too badly, pulling in just behind Da Vinci and Galileo. So even though, as you may already know, some of Freud's ideas seem wacky, some of them are run up against and are not well supported by psychological evidence, it's certainly not entirely correct. A lot of the stuff doesn't look good in light of 21st century psychology. Nonetheless, no other psychologist has a ranking in the most influential people of the millennium next to Da Vinci and Galileo and above Edison. And so that's why, if you're going to pay tuition at a university, somebody should tell you something about who Freud was sooner or later. I'm going to do two really brief film clips and then do the straightforward stuff. One of the Freud said this is that, and define this as something, learning. One of the important things about Freud, is one of the reasons he has such big impact. Oh, that's the dumb actor playing Freud. We don't want the actor. Is because of an historical context. Hopefully there'll be some sound coming out of the sound system your tuition dollars are paying for. That's an actor.
What was this world whose sleep Freud troubled? In the 50 years before World War I, man was convinced he was moving toward his final perfection. In this new age of science, he was little favored by doubt. It was Sigmund Freud, more than any other man, who disturbed this smug optimism. Freud's native city of Vienna was as self-satisfied as any in Europe. He came from a large, lower, middle-class Jewish family. Until he was almost 40, he led a fairly conventional life. His specialty as a young doctor was research into the nervous system, and he became the leading authority in Europe on paralysis in children.
So Freud, that was really brief intentionally. So at circa 1890, 95, Freud's a physician. He's living in a city that, I know it's easy to stereotype cities, it must have been more complex than this, but have this spirit of this 19th century progress that you already know just from knowing stuff or from other classes you'll see gets disturbed somehow by the early 20th century. Somehow at some point art seems to display this like impulsive breaking free of an animalistic kind of quality that if you see, just know the work of Picasso or see that in a class, suddenly, you know, there's this mix of imagery that looks Western, civilized, and savage, and we get kind of a rethinking of human nature. He wasn't alone. He was part of a general rethinking of human nature, but the film is probably not an overstatement. Freud has such a big impact because the work ends up questioning essentially the implicit Western Europe, North America worldview of rational decision-making human being who can calmly go about the world and think smartly. I'll skip the second one for now. If you want to hear Freud himself, there is one recording of Freud. You can just punch it up under Freud recording, and he describes in his best English, obviously that was not his first language, what he did. But here's what he did. So this person who's so famous and shows up in some psychology classes and elsewhere is trained as a physician, becomes a psychologist, and does something that, at least in general, turns out to have been a good idea. In the details, he does it in some ways that are kind of wacky, but in general, is a good idea. Way ahead of his time, he imagines some connection between physical states and essentially mental states. He understands fully, just as in our textbook, that there are levels of analysis, that in principle the mental states could be understood as products of the brain. But Freud also knows, hey, this is 1895, we don't know enough about the brain yet to run a science of brain that explains interesting things about personality. So Freud intentionally runs a psychology at the level of people and their mind, not the brain. The stuff we take for granted about the brain, like there are a bunch of individual cells that communicate with chemicals, just wasn't even that wasn't known in Freud's day. They had to do these, if you know, from biology, these staining techniques to isolate the cells, et cetera, before you could even have that kind of evidence. Freud's evidence entirely consisted of case studies. We saw one earlier when we said there were different forms of research. So the first case study, which comes to Freud from a colleague actually, is somebody who reports to her symptoms, a woman now known as Anna O in the literature. Actually, you can see her name here in tiny print. Bertha Pappenheim, who actually was a founder after getting over her psychological problems of essentially what we think of as a social work movement in Austria in the late 1800s, showed up at a physician reporting unusual physical symptoms. They're really unusual. She reports having trouble seeing. Suddenly one day she can't see clearly. She reports having trouble using a hand. She has no hand injury, but has a kind of a hand paralysis. There's one day where she reports that she can speak only in English, not in German, her native language. you know something's up if people are having trouble speaking in their native language. There's a bunch of stuff that's obviously not like normal, organic, bodily illness stuff. What happens is she and her physician, and then this is the technique Freud adopts, discuss the origins of these problems. What she does, in essence, this woman discovered Freud's famous technique, but obviously all the physicians of the day were men. This person gets no particular credit. But this woman of the day discovers this technique. She discovers herself that when she talks about these problems, she's able to trace them to events in childhood. That the events are inevitably very traumatic. So the problem with her using her hand, she traces to some event in which she was sexually attacked by an uncle and sort of pushed him off. When she traces these traumas back to some earlier source, inevitably one she hadn't thought of for years, but it suddenly comes back to her, she relives the traumatic event, but then reports to her physician, hey, I'm feeling better. She can move her hand. She speaks more clearly. Her squinting clears up after recounting some event when her father was dying and she was crying and couldn't see something. All these kind of traumatic events, when they get out in the open, they're sort of confessed, lead to a lessening of symptoms. So Freud pays attention to this. Freud starts to, this is radical at the time. So this guy, we're doing this kind of briefly, but this Freud guy was doing things that were outrageous at the time. That must have seemed, well, clearly did to some people seem unethical. Somebody shows up for medical treatment at plain old Freud MD office. He engages the person in this new form of treatment that's not biomedical, but that's psychomedical and has people talk about their symptoms. Day after day, once or twice a week, for weeks, if not months or more, that's the treatment. What Freud observes, he reports, is exactly what his colleague had observed, a lessening of symptoms when people recover in their mind somewhere this buried past trauma. That fundamentally is the phenomenon. There's another one we'll get to in a second, dreams. But fundamentally, everything that makes Freud the, whatever that was, 12th highest impact thinker in the 1,000 years of Western civilization, stems from Freud saying, gee, this is weird. The person today said Freud's patients were predominantly women, remembered something that she'd forgotten for 20 years since she was 8 years old, and now she remembered it and is feeling better. That raises a lot of questions all at once, including where was the idea that she couldn't think of for the 20 years, is obviously one of the many questions. So Freud develops this method for treating people, which he calls the cathartic method. And the observations of what happens in this therapy method are what then spur the theory that we'll get to. The method is actually sort of simple, and Freud's work is, in some ways, the brilliant part is that the core ideas are actually relatively simple. Even if you know them well, you'll realize, yeah, it's possible to convey the core ideas in the next 10 minutes of class. The concept here is that when a person digs back into the unconscious, usually with the help of the therapist, and relives the traumatic experience, there's some kind of release of energy. Freud was living in a day in which there was a lot of energy physics, which sounds sort of obvious, but even that stuff in your physics class had to be discovered at one point, and a lot of it was 19th century Central Europe researchers who you see in the physics classes. And so Freud had this model of mind in which he imagined it as being kind of like a machine, an energy system, where you could release some energy, very much like you'd release, pressure built up in some kind of, steam engine that might blow up if you don't release the pressure. So now Freud, while doing this, gradually develops a picture of the mind that if only this was a class with 10 people and we would pause and have an exercise, you could probably imagine yourself. From the little text on top of the screen, there have to be at least two parts of mind and they both have to have some kind of energy. So Freud's concept is, he develops his theory gradually over a span of literally decades, but the concept at first is there's some part of the mind that's storing unacceptable traumatic ideas. You can't get rid of them exactly, but it's kind of like if you had a library with traumatic experiences and a variety of X-rated books, you could put them in the basement and lock the door. This is very, very much like what Freud is thinking, except that the stuff in the basement would have like a glowing energy, and sometimes the energy would build up so much that there would be a problem storing it down there. The energy is coming up and causing problems, and what happens is in the therapy, whoops, went too fast, there's a release of the energy. Freud is imagining, especially early in his career, very physicalistic energy, which makes sense since there's a brain and it's part of a body which has literally physical energies. He's imagining that ideas are associated with energy, and sometimes the energy is so large that, like a steam engine that's going to blow up, you have to let off some of the energy. Freud did have a second phenomenon of interest, which also is famously associated with Freud, which is dreams. That's the German edition of I guess that's the first edition of what's published in English as the Interpretation of Dreams. If Granny has one of these in the attic, grab it right away. There were not many. This is certainly one of the 2 or 3 highest impact books of the history of psychology. Certainly must be easily one of the 10 biggest impact books of the 20th century. In its first couple of years of publication, it only sold a couple of 100 copies. There are not many first editions. It took a while for people to catch on to what Freud was doing. The interpretation of dreams goes like this. If you want to read something that's interesting in psychology, speculative as it is, it's a series of dreams. Freud reports these dreams, word for word, as people say them, and then reports his interpretations, with apologies that this dream is going to have this sort of stereotypic sexist quality, one of the drawbacks of Freud's work. He reports a dream that is, sorry about all the verbiage, an intelligent lady patient reports this dream. I'll tell you about a dream. The content is quite the opposite of your idea, which we'll get to, of wish fulfillment. I want to give a supper. I've got nothing available except some mangy old smoked salmon. I think I'll go shopping, but I remember it's Sunday afternoon when all the shops are closed. Shops used to be closed on Sunday. I then try to ring up a few caterers. They did have phones. The telephone's out of order. I have to renounce my desire to give a supper. A supper here, this is a wealthy person in Vienna, so it's like one of these, dinners where other wealthy people show up and then they have a little Viennese Gazette news thing about the nice dinner. Freud writes, and this is how Freud writes, it's a little like reading a Sherlock Holmes mystery. The ideas elicited so far are insufficient for the interpretation of the dream. I press for more, Freud writes. After a short pause corresponding to the overcoming of a resistance, that means a desire not to think of something that the person isn't even aware that they're getting in their own way of thinking. The woman reports that the day before she had paid a visit to a friend of whom she's jealous because her husband is always praising this other woman so highly. This friend is very thin and lanky. Her husband likes full figures, Freud tells us. Now, of what did this thin friend speak? Of course, of her wish to become plumper. She also asked my patient, when are you going to invite us again? You always have such good food. Now, the meaning of the dream is clear. The dream tells you, he tells the woman, that you cannot give the supper, thereby fulfilling your wish not to contribute anything to the rounding out of your friend's figure. This is a very simple version of Freud's dreams, and if anybody in the room has seen this, you know what it's like. Commonly, the dream seems like a normal dream. Oh, I'm, worried I'm going to show up late for the exam. By the end, Freud has interpreted the dream, well, you wanted to slaughter 8 people, including your mother, and then have sex. But he does it not arbitrarily, but through finding bits and pieces of the dream and reasoning that they had to be there for a reason, and then like rearranging the pieces. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, quite reasonably said that in Freud's theory, the dreams are like a jigsaw puzzle that's not put together. So all the pieces are there, but they're scrambled, and Freud essentially unscrambles them into their actual meaning. So the idea, if we did a big thing on dreams, dreams could just be random. We'll have more on dreams later. It could be just random brain firings. It's just nothing. It could be that the dreams fundamentally are about things that might go wrong. There are theories of dreams that suggest we have dreams essentially to prepare us for threats in the environment and keep us all kind of warmed up. But Freud suggested that dreams actually were fulfillments of wishes. The idea is that some wishes, oh, let's starve out the other woman so she's not attractive, are socially unacceptable, so you don't say them to people during the day. The idea is still in your mind. So at night, kind of the censorship of the mind is broken down a bit, and the wishes fuel the storyline of the dreams. If you were to draw, so the stuff that's hidden when you're awake kind of sneaks out at night and becomes the storyline of the dream. So this is the second phenomenon to explain. I'll skip these pictures. You know that. So Freud has these two phenomena in mind and then starts working. So circa 1895, he's working away, and he's working away till 1939, almost continuously working on this thing that's called psychoanalytic theory and his writings about it. So the nature of the theory is now kind of straightforward. If we did this a little more slowly, you could kind of figure out, well, the mind has to have different parts. If an idea was here and then it was over there, there had to be a here and a there, which means that the mind isn't like a computer with a central processor. It's sort of like a computer with a couple of processors and some hard drives, and one of the hard drives is locked because it has some violent or pornographic content. It's very, very much like that. Despite the spelling here with the extra L, what Freud proposes formally as a theory is that the mind contains three personality structures, or three systems. Freud talking about these systems is not that different than if somebody said, oh, there's a cardiovascular system, and there's a respiratory system. It's kind of like that. He can't do the biology of it. He thinks that a century later people could, maybe. But he reasonably can propose three functional systems that are called the id, ego, and superego. And by the way, the term, when people are aware of things, he uses the term conscious and unconscious. For all intents and purposes, at least for today, you can think of aware of it or possibly aware of it, like you remember what you had as snacks during the Super Bowl, as conscious, and unconscious being the stuff that's kind of buried away and it's there in your mind, but you can't recall it. So with that background, it's then straightforward to Freud to suggest that there are three psychological systems. And the systems, the fun part of the theory, is that they're kind of at war. They do different things. They conflict with one another. Obviously, this is also in the textbook. One he calls the id, which I've been told a better translation simply would have been the it, but they used the term the id when going into English. But the it meant this sort of uncivilized, animalistic, impulsive part of personality. A system that contains mental energy, including the energies associated with ideas that are repressed, plus basic impulses. We're doing the quick version of Freud's theory, but he sees aggression and sex as just these basic impulses, which of course in some way evolutionarily kind of makes sense. So he's imagining the storehouse of stuff that you're not fully aware of, that's buried down there, that contains a bunch of impulses and traumatic ideas that were so bad to think of, some childhood trauma, that it's repressed, all its energy is repressed down into the id. Secondly, so Freud imagines if you're literally a one-year-old child, you're essentially all id. To get around in the world, sooner or later, you have to develop more mind. More mind part two to Freud is something Freud calls the ego. What the Freudian use of the term ego is a system of mind that develops strategies. Strategies for satisfying the desires of the id while not getting into big trouble. The simplistic example, which is not wrong because it's simplistic, it is what Freud has in mind, is, you know, a one-year-old just grabbing a cookie and a 2.5-year-old looking to see where mom is and grabbing the cookie when she's out of the room. Literally that level of, oh, I'll do this thing now, and then I won't get in trouble, which then can, of course, flower into a whole way of dealing with the world of strategies for not getting into trouble while doing something you're not supposed to. These strategies for not getting into trouble are called defense mechanisms. So Freud imagines, and this is probably the best part of Freudian theory, that we sort of automatically do certain things to not get in trouble and to protect ourselves, including protect ourselves from anxiety. So everyday behaviors like you broke up with somebody and then talk about how horrible the person is, to Freud is a defense mechanism. You're essentially protecting yourself, your own psyche, by downplaying the importance of the other relationship. Or if you totally forget some traumatic event, you're repressing it, a defense mechanism.
So would you consider the fight and flight mechanism to be part of the ego?
Oh, that's interesting. A quick aside, because I think the right answer has to be no, is that we actually know now, though Freud didn't exactly know then, that there are some systems built in for all the mammals I know of that are fight-flight systems. So if there's a squirrel outside after class and it sees you, it's either going to run away or totally freeze. And it's no coincidence. It's not that squirrel. That's what they tend to do. So there's a system of protection that either is a freeze or go. I think there's no, that's right, there's no good Freud answer for that. There honestly is not. The reason why there isn't a good Freud answer, then I'll get back to the actual content, you folks at home, is that Freud imagined a go system in the id, but not a stop system in the id. And then the freeze system is so automatic that it's not quite the strategic thing Freud has in mind. Because even a young child must have a freeze system earlier than Freud imagined it has an ego. So there are things that outside of Freudian psychology, I mean, you picked up one perfectly, where there's no really good answer. I think that since the fight-flight evolved after Freud first thought of this theory, he just didn't put it together well enough. For those of you who track this in detail, Freud also did not seriously make use of Darwinian evolutionary biology, even though it was there. The notion that the id gets you into trouble a lot, why something would evolve that gets people into trouble a lot is kind of funny. There are a lot of features of Freudian theory that look a little funny when you run them through contemporary biology, even though he was trained as a physician. And then thirdly, whoops, there we go. To account for things like feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, self-criticism, which is sort of a funny thing as a human quality, but totally pervasive. People feeling bad because they're feeling bad about themselves. The person feeling bad about yourself is you. It seems like you're shooting yourself in the foot. But this kind of guilt and shame and self-criticism, Freud imagines coming from something called the superego. He thinks it's a natural tendency of the human mind to incorporate rules of society, to transfer from mommy and daddy said I can't do this to doing this is bad. That kind of language in which this is bad, a good child doesn't do this, as opposed to I'll get in trouble, shows an internalization of the rules of society. So what Freud imagines in picture form, this is from the book, and very much like a picture that Freud himself draws, is a kind of an iceberg model of mind in which if you talk to somebody about their day, you get a conscious report that's essentially a tiny little sliver of mind, defense mechanisms, presentation of self, and a whole bunch of the mind is buried down in the unconscious. Both the id impulses and parts of the superego, because you just feel guilty and sometimes don't exactly know why. It's those sort of feelings. I'm anxious. I don't know why. I'm feeling really bad about myself. I don't know why. That stuff, Freud is saying you don't know why because 90% of the stuff of psychology is of your own psychology is outside of consciousness. It's kind of buried down there, and Freud uses vivid metaphors. One of them is this kind of iceberg thing, meaning, you can run into some trouble here. There's a lot going on down there. You're unaware of it. That's a very different picture of human nature than you get from rationalist 19th century view, a rethinking in which people are behavior's kind of out of control. You don't know why you're taking action. You feel a certain way on a certain day. You have no idea why. It's suggesting a whole world of mind is outside of awareness. And to a certain extent, even when one criticizes Freud, that idea is pretty reasonably correct. A lot of mental activity, of course, is outside of awareness.